Every parent's worst nightmare is losing a child, but imagine being that child and losing everyone you love. In the freezing winter of 1871, a mountain man named Henrik found two little girls outside an abandoned cabin in Wyoming. One was already gone, and the other was barely alive. The surviving girl looked up at this stranger with tears in her eyes and said something that would haunt him forever. She begged him to bury her baby sister before the ground got too hard. Henrik was a loner who had given up on people years ago, but something about this broken child touched his heart. He took her in, thinking he would just help her through the winter. But as the snow trapped them together, he discovered the girls were hiding a terrible secret about what really happened to their mother. What dark truth would make a dying child trust a stranger with her sister's burial? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled like a banshee across the Wyoming peaks, carrying with it the bitter promise of death that only a mountain winter could deliver. Henrik Nordahl had grown accustomed to such sounds over the past 15 years, had learned to read the language of the storm like other men read newspapers. Tonight, though, something felt different. The air carried a weight that pressed against his chest, a heaviness that spoke of more than just weather. He stood at the single window of his cabin, a structure he'd built with his own hands from timber hewn during better days, when his back was stronger and his heart less burdened. The glass was thick and wavy, distorting the world outside into abstract shapes of white and grey. Snow fell in sheets so dense they seemed solid, like curtains drawn across the face of creation itself. Henrik was a large man, broad through the shoulders and chest, with hands that bore the calluses of decades spent working wood and stone and iron. His beard, once golden like wheat in summer fields, had turned silver-white, streaked with the kind of premature grey that comes not from age, but from carrying weights too heavy for any one soul to bear. His eyes, pale blue as winter ice, held depths that most folks found unsettling to look into for long. Those same eyes had watched his wife Sarah succumb to consumption 8 years prior, had seen the light fade from her gentle face as she struggled for each breath in their bed back in Minnesota. They had watched his daughter Emma, barely 6 years old, follow her mother into the grave just 3 days later, claimed by the same wasting disease that had stalked their small farming community like a wolf among sheep. After the burial, after the neighbors had stopped bringing casseroles and offering hollow words of comfort, Henrik had sold everything he owned and disappeared into the mountains. He told himself he was seeking solitude, a place to grieve in peace. The truth, which he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge even in the darkest hours before dawn, was that he was running from the memories, from the guilt, from the God who had taken everything that mattered and left him standing alone beside two small graves. The cabin sat in a natural bowl between 3 peaks, accessible only by a narrow trail that disappeared entirely under snow for months at a time. Henrik had chosen the location deliberately, wanting to be as far from civilization as a man could get, while still remaining technically among the living. He trapped for furs in the warmer months, made periodic trips to the trading post at Willow Creek to sell his pelts and buy supplies. The traders there knew him as a quiet man who paid his debts and minded his own business, which was exactly how he preferred it. His daily routine had become as rigid as the ice that formed on his water bucket each morning. Rise before dawn, check the weather, tend to his small fire. Breakfast was usually salt pork and hardtack, sometimes supplemented with meat from his snares if he'd been fortunate. Then came the work, maintaining his trap lines when weather permitted, repairing equipment, chopping wood, preparing for the next storm that was always coming in these mountains. Evenings were the hardest part. With the work done and darkness pressing in around the cabin like a living thing, there was nothing left but memory and the whiskey he rationed carefully to last through the long months. He'd carved a rough wooden cross from pine during his first winter here, meaning to place it somewhere as a memorial to Sarah and Emma. Instead, it sat on his mantelpiece, a reminder of loss that he couldn't quite bring himself to let go of or properly honor. Tonight felt different, though. Henrik couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the storm carried more than just snow and cold. He'd learned to trust his instincts during his years of solitude. They'd kept him alive when logic alone might have failed. The feeling had been growing stronger all day, a persistent itch between his shoulder blades that spoke of change, coming whether he wanted it or not. He was reaching for his coat to check on the woodpile when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. It was faint, almost lost in the wind's howling, but unmistakably human. A voice, high and thin, calling out in distress. Henrik froze, one arm halfway into his coat sleeve. He'd lived alone for so long that he sometimes heard voices in the wind, phantom calls from the past that existed only in his guilt-ridden imagination. But this sound came again, clearer now, and it was definitely real. Someone was out there in the storm. He finished pulling on his coat and grabbed the oil lantern from beside the door. The wind hit him like a physical blow when he stepped outside, driving snow into his face with stinging force. The cold was brutal, the kind that could kill an unprepared person in minutes. He raised the lantern high and peered into the swirling white darkness. "Hello?" he called out, his voice nearly lost in the storm. "Anyone there?" The answer came from his left, near the old abandoned trapper's cabin that sat 50 yards from his own dwelling. The structure had been there when he arrived, already falling into disrepair, and he'd never bothered to fix it up. It was just close enough to serve as a shelter for travelers, though none had ever come this far into the wilderness during his time here. Henrik pushed through the knee-deep snow, following the sound of the voice. As he drew closer to the abandoned cabin, his lantern light revealed shapes huddled against the lee side of the building. 2 small forms, barely visible under what looked like blankets or coats. Children. His heart stopped for a moment, then began beating so hard he could hear it over the wind. 2 children alone in a blizzard that could kill a grown man. He reached them in 3 quick strides, dropping to his knees in the snow. The first child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, looked up at him with eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone so young. Her face was pale as birch bark, her lips blue with cold, but she was conscious and alert. In her arms, she cradled a smaller child, a baby or toddler wrapped in what appeared to be a quilt. "Please, mister," the girl said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the relative calm near the building. "Please help us. My sister, she's—" Her voice broke, and Henrik could see tears freezing on her cheeks. He didn't need her to finish the sentence. Even in the dim lantern light, he could see that the smaller child wasn't moving, wasn't breathing. The terrible stillness that only comes with death had settled over the tiny form. "How long have you been out here?" Henrik asked, but the girl was looking at him with an expression that made his chest tight. "Please, mister," she repeated, and now he could hear the desperation that had been hidden beneath her earlier composure. "Please don't let the ground freeze too hard. I need you to help me bury my sister before it's too late." The words hit Henrik like a physical blow. This child, this tiny slip of a girl who should have been safe in a warm home with people who loved her, was asking him to help her bury her dead sister. The responsibility of it, the sheer heartbreak of the request, nearly brought him to his knees. But Henrik Nordahl had learned something about heartbreak over the years. It didn't kill you, much as you might sometimes wish it would. It just made you stronger or harder or both. And right now, this child needed strength more than she needed his grief. "Come on," he said, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "Let's get you inside where it's warm. We'll figure out the rest later." He scooped up both children, the living and the dead, and carried them through the storm toward his cabin. The girl didn't protest, didn't ask questions. She simply held tight to her sister and trusted him to get them to safety. As Henrik pushed through his cabin door and into the blessed warmth beyond, he had no idea that this moment would change everything, that this broken child and her tragic burden would force him to confront not just his own buried pain, but secrets that ran deeper and darker than anything he could imagine. The wind continued to howl outside, but inside the cabin something had shifted. The silence that had been Henrik's companion for so many years was broken, replaced by the quiet breathing of a child who had somehow survived when survival should have been impossible. He laid both children on his bed, the living girl still clutching her sister with fierce protectiveness. The baby's face was peaceful, as if she were simply sleeping, but Henrik had seen enough death to recognize its presence. The girl, he would need to ask her name soon, watched him with eyes that seemed far older than her years. "What's your name, child?" he asked gently, pulling a chair close to the bed. "Mabel," she whispered. "And this is Ruth. She's my baby sister. She was so cold, and I couldn't keep her warm enough." Henrik felt something crack inside his chest, a pain so sharp and familiar that it took his breath away. This was how it started, he knew. This was how a man found himself caring again, despite every wall he'd built, every lesson he'd learned about the dangers of letting anyone matter. But as he looked at Mabel's face, at the trust and desperation written there in equal measure, he knew he was already lost. Whatever had brought these children to his doorstep in the middle of a killing storm, whatever secrets they carried or dangers they fled, he was committed now. The wooden cross on his mantelpiece seemed to watch over the scene, a silent reminder of love and loss, and the terrible courage required to risk both again. Dawn came grey and muted, filtered through clouds that still promised more snow. Henrik had barely slept, spending the night in his chair beside the bed, where Mabel lay curled around her sister's still form. The child had finally surrendered to exhaustion near midnight, but even in sleep, she hadn't loosened her protective grip on little Ruth. The storm had blown itself out sometime before sunrise, leaving behind that peculiar mountain silence that follows a blizzard, a quiet so complete it seemed to press against the eardrums. Henrik rose stiffly from his chair, his joints protesting the long night of uncomfortable vigilance, and moved to the window to assess the damage. Snow had drifted against the cabin walls in places, creating sculpted curves that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. The world outside looked pristine and deadly, a white wilderness that could swallow a man without trace. It was the kind of morning that reminded Henrik why he'd chosen this isolation, why civilization felt like a distant memory from another lifetime. Behind him, Mabel stirred and sat up, immediately checking on Ruth, as if hoping the night might have somehow undone what couldn't be undone. When she found her sister still and cold, her small shoulders sagged with a grief that no child should have to carry. "Morning, Mabel," Henrik said quietly, turning from the window. "How are you feeling?" "She's still—" Mabel's voice caught and she couldn't finish the sentence. "I know, child. I know." Henrik moved to the stove and began preparing coffee, needing something to do with his hands. "We need to talk about what comes next." Mabel nodded, though she didn't look at him. Her attention remained fixed on Ruth's peaceful face. "You promised to help me bury her before the ground gets too hard." The request hit Henrik fresh, like a blow he hadn't quite braced for. He'd spent enough winters in these mountains to know the bitter truth. The ground was likely already frozen solid beneath the snow. Digging a proper grave would require more effort than one man could reasonably manage, especially with the tools he had available. But he'd made a promise to a dying child, and some promises couldn't be broken regardless of practical difficulties. "I'll do what I can," he said, pouring hot coffee into a tin cup. "But first, I need to understand how you girls ended up here. This isn't a place anyone finds by accident." Mabel finally looked at him, and Henrik was struck again by how old her eyes seemed. "Mama sent us away. She said it wasn't safe anymore, that we had to find somewhere to hide until she could come for us." "Where did you come from? How far did you travel?" "From town. Mama put us on the wagon with Mr. Peterson, and he was supposed to take us to our aunt's house. But the wagon broke and Mr. Peterson—" She stopped, her face clouding with confusion. "Mr. Peterson said he couldn't fix it and we had to walk. Ruth was so tired, and it was getting dark, and then we found the old cabin." Something in her story didn't sit right with Henrik. The nearest town was Willow Creek, more than 30 miles away through terrain that would challenge an experienced woodsman, let alone 2 small children and whoever this Peterson fellow was. No responsible adult would abandon children in the wilderness, broken wagon or not. What's your mama's name, Mabel? Mary Patterson. The answer came quickly, but Henrik caught something, a slight hesitation as if the name required thought. And where exactly were you supposed to meet your aunt? This time the hesitation was more pronounced. I don't remember. Ruth was crying so much and everything was so scary. Henrik poured himself coffee and sat back down, studying the child's face. He'd learned to read people during his years before the mountains, back when he'd worked as a deputy sheriff in Minnesota. Mabel was hiding something, or at the very least, her story had holes big enough to drive a wagon through, but pressing a traumatized child for details seemed cruel, especially when she was grieving her sister. Whatever the truth was, it could wait until she'd had time to recover from the immediate shock. "Well," Henrik said, "first things first. Let me see what I can do about preparing a place for Ruth." He pulled on his heavy coat and stepped outside, immediately feeling the bite of air so cold it burned his lungs. The snow crunched under his boots as he made his way to the small shed where he kept his tools. A shovel, a pickaxe, a small collection of implements he'd accumulated for maintaining his property, none of them designed for the kind of work he now faced. Henrik spent the better part of the morning behind the cabin, clearing snow and attempting to break ground for a grave. The earth was indeed frozen solid, turned to stone by weeks of sub-zero temperatures. Even the pickaxe barely scratched the surface. After 2 hours of backbreaking effort, he'd managed to create little more than a shallow depression in the iron-hard soil. When he returned to the cabin, frustrated and exhausted, he found Mabel sitting beside Ruth, carefully combing the baby's hair with her fingers. She'd arranged the little body with touching care, straightening the tiny dress and folding the small hands across the chest. "The ground's too hard," Henrik admitted, hanging his coat by the door. "I'm going to have to build a shelter for Ruth until spring. When the thaw comes, we can give her a proper burial." To his surprise, Mabel nodded as if she'd expected this. "Mama always said the earth sleeps in winter. She said sometimes we have to wait for it to wake up before we can plant things or put things to rest." Her acceptance made Henrik's chest tight. This child had already learned too much about death and waiting and the cruel practicalities that grief demanded. He spent the rest of the day constructing a small shelter from lumber and stones, a temporary resting place that would protect Ruth's body from animals until spring allowed for proper burial. It wasn't much, but it was respectful, and it gave Mabel the peace of knowing her sister wouldn't be left exposed to the elements. That evening, as they shared a simple meal of beans and salt pork, Henrik tried again to understand their story. "Mabel, can you tell me more about why your mama sent you away? Was someone threatening your family?" Mabel pushed food around her plate without eating much. "There were bad men. Mama said they wanted to hurt us because of what Papa did. But Papa's been gone for a long time." "Gone how? Did he die?" "I think so. Mama never talks about him much, but I found this in her things." Mabel reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. Henrik's breath caught when she unwrapped it. It was a daguerreotype, the kind of formal family portrait that well-to-do families commissioned for special occasions. The image showed 2 young girls, clearly, Mabel and Ruth, standing beside a woman who bore little resemblance to the Mary Patterson Mabel had described, but it was the man in the photograph that made Henrik's blood run cold. He was wearing a badge, clearly visible on his vest. A lawman's badge. And his face, Henrik had seen that face before years ago, in wanted posters and newspaper reports about corruption investigations in the territorial government. "Mabel," Henrik said carefully, "where did you say you got this picture?" "It was in Mama's coat. She told me to keep it safe, that it was important. But I don't understand why." Henrik stared at the photograph, pieces of a puzzle beginning to form in his mind. If this man was indeed Mabel's father, and if he was the same lawman Henrik remembered reading about, then these children weren't just refugees from domestic trouble. They were witnesses to something much more dangerous, and if dangerous men were indeed looking for them, then Henrik's isolated cabin might not remain a sanctuary for very long. "Mabel," he said, his voice gentle but serious, "I need you to think very carefully. When your mama sent you away, did she say anything about who these bad men were? Did she mention any names?" But Mabel had fallen asleep at the table, exhaustion finally claiming her small body. Henrik carried her to the bed and covered her with blankets, then sat staring at the photograph by lamplight. Whatever secrets these children carried, whatever danger had driven them into the wilderness, Henrik found himself committed to protecting them. The realization surprised him. For years, he'd wanted nothing more than to be left alone with his grief and memories. Now faced with a child who needed protection and a mystery that threatened them both, he felt something stirring that he'd thought died with his own family. Purpose, responsibility, the dangerous, beautiful burden of caring about someone other than himself. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, promising another storm. But inside the cabin, Henrik sat watchful and alert, already planning how to defend what he'd suddenly found himself unable to abandon. The days that followed established a rhythm born of necessity and grief. Henrik had never cared for a child, not really. Even with his own daughter, Emma, Sarah had handled most of the daily nurturing while he worked their small farm. Now, faced with Mabel's needs and her profound sorrow, he found himself learning patience he didn't know he possessed. Mabel barely spoke for the first 3 days, moving through the cabin like a ghost, eating only when Henrik insisted, staring out the window toward the small shelter where Ruth lay. Henrik understood the silence. He'd worn it like armor for years after his own losses, wrapping himself in quiet until words became foreign things that belonged to other people. But on the 4th morning, something shifted. Henrik was checking his trap lines, following the familiar path through snow-laden pines, when he heard a sound that stopped him cold, singing, a thin, wavering voice carrying a children's lullaby through the crystal air. He found Mabel sitting beside Ruth's shelter, her small form bundled in one of his spare coats that hung nearly to her ankles. She was singing softly, the same song over and over, her breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. "Mabel," Henrik said gently, not wanting to startle her. "You'll catch your death out here." She looked up at him with eyes that seemed clearer than they'd been since her arrival. "Ruth likes this song. Mama used to sing it when Ruth couldn't sleep." Henrik felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the recognition of a heart trying to heal itself through ritual and memory. "It's a pretty song, but Ruth would want you to stay warm, don't you think?" Mabel considered this seriously, then nodded. She allowed Henrik to help her to her feet, and together they walked back to the cabin. But something had changed in those few minutes. The absolute silence that had surrounded her was beginning to crack. That afternoon, as Henrik worked on repairing a broken snare, Mabel approached him with something clutched in her small fist. "Mr. Henrik?" Her voice was still soft, but it carried more strength than before. "Just Henrik is fine, child. What do you have there?" She opened her hand to reveal a small ring, tarnished silver with tiny engravings around the band. "I found this sewn into the lining of my dress. I don't remember Mama putting it there." Henrik took the ring carefully, holding it up to catch the light from the cabin's single window. The engravings were faded but still visible, initials that made his pulse quicken, EW and MR. The style was old-fashioned, the kind of wedding band that spoke of promises made with full hearts and honest intentions. "Do you know what these letters mean?" Henrik asked. Mabel shook her head. "Mama's name was Mary, but her last name was Patterson, not R. And I don't know anyone named EW. Henrik studied the ring more carefully. The craftsmanship was fine, expensive, not the sort of jewelry a woman like the Mary Patterson that Mabel described would likely own. Combined with the photograph, it painted a picture that grew more complex with each revelation. "Mabel, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Are you certain your mama's name was Mary Patterson?" The question seemed to surprise her. "Of course. That's what everyone called her." what everyone called her or what she told people to call her. Mabel's forehead creased in concentration. I'm not sure. There was a time when I was little when she had a different name. But she said that was before, when things were different. Henrik felt pieces of the puzzle shifting, trying to find their proper places. A woman who changed her name, children with a photograph of a different family, a wedding ring with initials that didn't match the story they'd been told. Each clue pointed toward deception, but deception born of protection rather than malice. "Tell me about your papa," Henrik said. "The man in the photograph. Do you remember him at all?" "A little. He was tall like you, but not as broad. He had kind eyes, and he always smelled like leather and soap. Mama said he was a good man who tried to help people, but that helping people sometimes made enemies." Mabel's voice grew smaller. "She said that's why the bad men wanted to hurt us. Because Papa helped people they didn't want helped." Henrik nodded, the picture becoming clearer. A lawman investigating corruption would indeed make powerful enemies. If he'd been killed for his efforts, his family would become targets as well. Changing names, moving frequently, hiding their true identities. It all made sense as a survival strategy, but it also meant that the danger Mabel and Ruth had fled was very real and very serious. That evening, Henrik made a decision that surprised him with its ease. He would keep Mabel safe, whatever the cost. The realization should have terrified him. He'd spent years avoiding exactly this kind of responsibility, this vulnerability to loss. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced since before Sarah's illness: purpose. As if sensing his thoughts, Mabel looked up from the simple stew they were sharing. "Henrik, are you going to send me away when the snow melts?" The question hit him like a physical blow. "Why would you think that?" "Because nobody keeps children they don't have to keep. Mama said people have their own troubles, and we can't expect them to carry ours too." Henrik set down his spoon and looked directly into her eyes. "Mabel, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I'm not going to send you away. Not in spring, not ever, unless you want to go. You belong here now, understand?" Something shifted in her expression, a careful hope that had been buried under layers of loss and disappointment. "Really? Really. We'll figure out the rest as we go along, but you don't have to worry about being sent away." That night, for the first time since her arrival, Mabel slept soundly. Henrik sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle and thinking about the future he'd suddenly acquired. It wouldn't be easy. Caring for a child never was, even under normal circumstances. And these circumstances were far from normal. But as he watched Mabel sleep, her small face peaceful in the firelight, Henrik felt something he'd thought died with his own family. Not just purpose, but joy. The dangerous, complicated joy of loving someone enough to fight for them. Outside, snow began to fall again, adding another layer to the white walls that surrounded their small world. Spring seemed impossibly distant, but Henrik found he was no longer impatient for its arrival. For the first time in years, he had reason to appreciate the present moment, to value the quiet intimacy of shared meals and evening conversations, and the simple fact of not being alone. The ring sat on the table beside the lamp, its tarnished surface catching the light. Tomorrow he would ask Mabel more questions. Tomorrow he would begin planning for the threats that might come with the spring thaw. But tonight he was content to sit guard over a sleeping child who trusted him enough to lower her defenses. The wooden cross on the mantelpiece seemed less accusatory now, more like a blessing on this unexpected second chance at family. Henrik had learned the hard way that love always came with the risk of loss. But he was beginning to remember that the risk was worth taking, that the alternative, a life without love, wasn't really living at all. A week into their new routine, Henrik discovered that Mabel possessed an artist's eye for detail. She'd been sitting quietly at the table, working with a piece of charcoal from the fire and a scrap of paper Henrik had given her. When she looked up with something approaching excitement, "Henrik, I drew our journey. The way we came here." Henrik moved to look over her shoulder and felt his breath catch. What Mabel had created wasn't the simple child's drawing he'd expected, but a surprisingly detailed map showing mountains, valleys, and what appeared to be several distinct settlements. The route she'd sketched wound through terrain that would have taken weeks to traverse on foot. "This is very good, Mabel. Can you tell me about these places?" Henrik pointed to the various marks along the route. "That's where we started," she said, indicating a cluster of buildings at one end of the map. "And that's where Mr. Peterson's wagon broke." Her finger traced the path to a point roughly halfway along the journey. "But we didn't walk from there. There was another man, and he had a different wagon." Henrik felt the familiar prickle of unease that came whenever Mabel's story revealed new complications. "Another man? You didn't mention him before. I forgot." Everything was so scary, and Ruth was sick. Mabel's voice grew smaller, the way it did when she was remembering difficult things. "The man said he would take us to safety, but he made us hide under blankets in the back of his wagon. He said if anyone stopped us, we had to stay very quiet." The implications hit Henrik like a cold wind. This wasn't the story of children lost in a simple accident. This was the story of children being transported in secret, hidden from view, passed from one handler to another like contraband. "What did this second man look like, Mabel?" "He was younger than you, and he had a scar here." She traced a line across her left cheek. "He seemed nice at first, but then he got angry when Ruth wouldn't stop crying. He said—" She stopped, her small face troubled. "What did he say?" "He said maybe he should just leave us by the road, that he wasn't being paid enough to deal with crying babies. That's when I got scared and took Ruth and ran into the woods." Henrik studied the map more carefully, noting the distances involved. Even with wagons and multiple drivers, the journey Mabel had drawn would have taken considerable time and planning. This wasn't a desperate mother's hasty escape plan. It was something more organized, more deliberate. "Mabel, when your mama first told you that you had to leave, did she say anything about these men? Did she know them?" "She said they were friends of Papa's, men who could be trusted." But Mabel hesitated, her fingers worrying the edge of the paper. "But what?" "But the first man, Mr. Peterson, he didn't talk about Papa like he knew him. When I mentioned Papa's name, he looked confused. And the second man, when he got angry, he said things about Papa that weren't nice." Henrik felt pieces of a darker puzzle beginning to emerge. If these men weren't actually friends of Mabel's father, if they were strangers hired to transport the children, then who had arranged for their services? And why had the arrangement gone wrong? "Can you remember anything else about what the second man said when he was angry?" Mabel's face scrunched in concentration. "He said something about payment, and about how the job wasn't what he'd signed up for. And he said—" She paused, clearly struggling with a memory that frightened her. "He said that maybe the people who hired him didn't really want us to reach where we were going." The words hit Henrik like a physical blow. The possibility that had been nagging at him suddenly crystallized into terrible clarity. What if the men transporting the children hadn't been hired by their mother to ensure their safety? What if they'd been hired by her enemies to ensure the opposite? Henrik forced his voice to remain calm. "Mabel, I need you to think very carefully. When you ran away from the second man, how far did you and Ruth travel before you found the old cabin?" "We walked all day. Ruth was so tired and it was getting dark. I was carrying her most of the way because she kept falling down." Mabel's voice broke slightly. "I tried to keep her warm, but she was so little, and the snow kept getting deeper." Henrik looked at the map again, calculating distances and terrain. For two small children to have walked all day through mountain wilderness in winter and somehow found the abandoned cabin near his property, it defied belief. Either Mabel's sense of distance was severely distorted by trauma and exhaustion, or there were still pieces of the story missing. "Show me on the map where you ran away from the second man." Mabel pointed to a spot that, according to her drawing, was at least 15 miles from Henrik's cabin through some of the most difficult terrain in the territory. Even an experienced woodsman would struggle to cover that distance in a single day during winter conditions. "Mabel, are you sure you and Ruth were alone when you made this part of the journey?" The question seemed to surprise her. I think so. But everything was so confusing, and I was so scared. Maybe, she stopped, her face clouding with uncertainty. Maybe what? Maybe there was someone else. Someone who helped us find the cabin. But I can't remember clearly. It's all mixed up in my head. Henrik felt the familiar frustration of trying to piece together truth from the memories of a traumatized child. Mabel's recollections were fragmented, colored by fear and grief and the natural confusion that comes with extreme stress. But beneath the inconsistencies, a disturbing pattern was emerging. That afternoon, while Mabel napped, Henrik studied her map more carefully. If her drawing was even approximately accurate, it revealed a transportation network that extended far beyond what a desperate mother could have arranged on her own. The route showed knowledge of backroads and remote trails, the kind of information that would require either extensive local knowledge or connections to people who possessed such knowledge. The more Henrik learned about Mabel and Ruth's journey, the more convinced he became that they'd been caught up in something much larger and more dangerous than a simple family fleeing domestic threats. The children weren't just witnesses to their father's death, they were living evidence of whatever corruption he'd been investigating, and if Henrik was right, then the men who'd killed their father would eventually realize that the children had escaped their hired transporters. When spring came and travel became easier, they would start looking for two little girls who could identify them and testify about their crimes. Henrik spent the evening sharpening his knives and checking his ammunition. He'd thought his fighting days were long behind him, but it seemed fate had other plans. Whatever was coming, he would be ready for it. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, but inside the cabin, Mabel slept peacefully, trusting in his protection. Henrik sat by the fire, planning strategies he hoped he'd never need to use, preparing for a war he prayed would never come. Henrik's discovery came 3 weeks after Mabel's arrival, hidden in the most unlikely place. He'd been helping her change into a clean dress, one of his old shirts cut down to size, when something crinkled in the heel of her worn boot. Investigating, he found a folded piece of newspaper, water-stained and fragile, pressed flat against the leather sole. The paper was a fragment from the Cheyenne Leader, dated December 15th, 1871. Henrik's hands trembled slightly as he read the headline, "Local family perishes in house fire. Sheriff's investigation continues." The article was brief, reporting that a widow named Mary Patterson and her 2 young daughters had died when their small home outside Willow Creek caught fire during a blizzard. The reporter noted that Sheriff William Crane was investigating the incident, as the fire appeared to have started under suspicious circumstances. Henrik read the article twice, then looked at the date again. December 15th, but according to Mabel, they'd left their home weeks before that date, transported by the mysterious Mr. Peterson and his associate. The timeline didn't just fail to match, it created an impossible contradiction. "Mabel," Henrik said carefully, showing her the newspaper clipping, "can you tell me where this came from?" She looked at the paper with obvious recognition. "Mama gave it to me. She said I should keep it hidden, that it was important, but I shouldn't let anyone see it. Do you know what it says?" Mabel shook her head. "I can't read very well yet. Mama was teaching me, but we didn't have much time for lessons." Henrik felt his chest tighten as he realized a terrible truth the newspaper revealed. According to this report, Mary Patterson and her daughters were already dead when Mabel and Ruth had supposedly begun their journey. Either the newspaper was wrong, or the woman who'd sent the children away wasn't their mother at all. "Mabel, I need to ask you something very important. The woman you called Mama, was she the same woman who gave birth to you and Ruth?" The question seemed to confuse her. "What do you mean? Did you always live with her? Do you remember being a baby with her?" Mabel's forehead creased in concentration. I think so, but there was another lady before. A lady who looked more like me. But she went away when I was little, and Mama said she was never coming back." Henrik's pulse quickened. "What happened to this other lady? The one who looked like you?" "I don't know. Mama said she got sick and had to go to heaven. But sometimes when Mama thought I wasn't listening, she would cry and say things about how sorry she was, and how she wished things could have been different. The pieces were beginning to form a picture that made Henrik's blood run cold. If Mabel and Ruth weren't Mary Patterson's biological children, if they'd been placed in her care after their real mother's death, then the newspaper article might be telling the truth about a very different tragedy. Mabel, can you remember anything about your papa? Not the man in the photograph, but your real papa, the one who was married to the lady who looked like you. He was a sheriff, Mabel said without hesitation. He had a badge, and he carried a gun, and he was trying to catch bad men. But the bad men found out, and they... Her voice broke, and she couldn't finish the sentence. Henrik felt the last pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Mabel and Ruth weren't just the children of a dead sheriff. They were witnesses to his murder. Their biological mother had likely died shortly after, whether from grief, illness, or violence, and they'd been placed with Mary Patterson for protection. But someone had discovered their location and arranged for Mary Patterson's death, making it look like the children had died with her. The men who'd been hired to transport the children weren't rescue workers. They were killers who'd been ordered to eliminate the last witnesses to the sheriff's murder. Mabel, Henrik said gently. The woman you called Mama, Mary Patterson, she wasn't your real mother, was she? Tears began to well in Mabel's eyes. I know, I've always known, sort of. But she loved us anyway, and she took care of us when no one else would. She said we were her family now, and that's all that mattered. Henrik felt his heart break for this child who'd already lost so much. She sounds like a very brave woman. And you're right, love is what makes a family, not blood. The bad men killed her too, didn't they? Mabel's voice was barely a whisper. Just like they killed Papa and Mama Ruth, my real mama. Henrik couldn't bring himself to lie to her. I think so, yes. I think Mary Patterson died protecting you and Ruth, making sure you could get away. Mabel nodded, as if she'd already known this truth but hadn't wanted to face it. That's why she gave me the newspaper. She wanted someone to know what really happened. She said someday, when I was older, I would understand why it was important. Do you know what your real name is, Mabel? Your family name before you lived with Mary Patterson? Whitfield, she said without hesitation. Mabel and Ruth Whitfield. Papa was Sheriff Edward Whitfield, and our real mama was Margaret Rose Whitfield. That's what the letters on the ring mean. E.W. and M.R. Henrik felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. Sheriff Edward Whitfield. He remembered that name now, remembered the stories that had circulated through law enforcement circles about a sheriff who'd gotten too close to exposing a territorial corruption ring involving stolen federal funds and fraudulent land deals. Whitfield had died in what was officially reported as a riding accident, but rumors suggested he'd been murdered to prevent him from testifying before a federal investigation committee. If those rumors were true, and if his children had witnessed the crime, then they were living proof of conspiracy and murder that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. No wonder powerful men wanted them dead. No wonder someone had gone to such elaborate lengths to fake their deaths and arrange for their elimination. Henrik looked at Mabel, this brave, broken little girl who carried within her memory the evidence to destroy careers and possibly bring justice for her father's murder. She was 8 years old, and she'd become the most dangerous person in the Wyoming territory without even understanding why. Mabel, Henrik said, I need you to understand something. The bad men who hurt your family, they think you're dead. That newspaper story was supposed to make everyone believe you and Ruth died in the fire with Mary Patterson. As long as they think that, you're safe. But what happens when they find out we're not dead? Henrik met her eyes with all the honesty he could muster. Then they'll come looking for us. And when they do, I'll be ready for them. That night, Henrik sat by the fire long after Mabel had fallen asleep. The newspaper clipping spread on the table before him. The corruption that had killed Edward Whitfield was still active, still powerful enough to arrange murders and cover-ups. But those responsible had made one crucial mistake. They'd left witnesses alive. Spring was still months away. But Henrik began making plans for what would come when the snow melted and travel became possible again. He would need weapons, supplies, and most importantly, a way to get Mabel's testimony to federal authorities before her enemies realized she was still alive. The wooden cross on the mantelpiece caught the firelight, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Henrik had spent years running from responsibility, from the pain of caring about others. But this child had given him something he'd thought lost forever, a chance to fight for justice, to protect innocence, to matter in ways that went beyond mere survival. Whatever came next, he would be ready. The discovery came by accident, as the most devastating truths often do. Henrik was mending Mabel's torn coat, the same garment she'd worn during her desperate flight through the mountains, when his fingers found something unusual sewn into the inner lining. A small pocket, barely noticeable, containing several water-damaged pages that had been carefully folded to the size of playing cards. The pages were from a child's diary, the kind with lined paper and a small lock that any determined adult could break. The ink had run in places, making some words illegible, but enough remained to paint a picture that made Henrik's hands shake as he read. Papa came home today with his badge all bent. He told Mama that the bad men know he found their secret papers. Mama cried and said we might have to go away soon. The man with the scar came to our house again. Papa told him to leave, but he just smiled and said Papa couldn't protect us forever. I don't like how he looks at me and Ruth. Papa is dead. They said his horse threw him, but I saw the man with the scar near the stable that morning. Mama is packing our things. She says we have to go live with Aunt Mary for a while. Henrik had to stop reading for a moment, his chest tight with rage and sorrow. These weren't the confused recollections of a traumatized child. They were the methodical observations of a little girl who'd witnessed her father's murder and understood enough to be terrified. He forced himself to continue reading. Aunt Mary isn't really our aunt, but she's nice, and she loved Papa like a brother. She says we'll be safe with her, but she keeps looking out the windows like she's watching for someone. The man with the scar found us. I saw him talking to Mr. Peterson in town. Aunt Mary saw him too, and now she's scared. She says we have to leave again, but this time it will be different. Aunt Mary put something in my coat and told me never to let anyone find it. She's crying and she keeps hugging us. I think something bad is going to happen. The final entry was written in a shaky hand, the words barely legible. The house is on fire. Aunt Mary pushed us out the window and told us to run to Mr. Peterson's wagon. She said to never look back, never tell anyone our real names. The man with the scar is coming. Henrik set the pages down, with hands that trembled with suppressed fury. The diary confirmed his worst suspicions and added new horrors. Mary Patterson had died in the fire that was supposed to kill the children. She'd sacrificed herself to create the illusion of their deaths while secretly arranging their escape, but the escape had been compromised from the beginning. Mr. Peterson, the man supposedly hired to transport them to safety, had been in contact with their father's killer. The entire rescue had been a trap, designed to eliminate the children while maintaining the fiction that they'd already died in the fire. Henrik, Mabel's voice came from behind him, soft and worried. What did you find? He turned to see her standing in the doorway, having awakened from her afternoon nap. Her small face was pale, but her eyes held the same terrible wisdom that had been forced upon her by circumstances no child should face. Your diary, Henrik said gently. The pages you hid in your coat? Mabel nodded as if she'd expected this discovery eventually. I wrote down everything I could remember. Aunt Mary said someday it might be important, that people might need to know the truth about what happened to Papa. Mabel, the man with the scar that you wrote about, he's the same man who transported you after Mr. Peterson's wagon broke, isn't he? Yes. Her voice was barely a whisper. When I saw him, I knew we were in terrible danger. That's why I grabbed Ruth and ran when he wasn't looking. I knew if we stayed with him, we would disappear forever. Henrik felt a cold rage settling in his chest, the kind of controlled fury that had made him effective as a lawman years ago. This child had not only witnessed her father's murder and survived multiple attempts on her life, she'd saved herself and her sister through courage and quick thinking that would have impressed seasoned adults. You were very brave. Mabel, your father would be proud of how you protected Ruth. Tears began to flow down her cheeks. But I couldn't save her in the end. She died anyway, and it's my fault. Henrik knelt beside her chair, taking her small hands in his weathered ones. Ruth died because she was too little to survive in the cold, not because of anything you did or didn't do. You kept her alive as long as anyone could have. You gave her love and protection right up to the end, and that's what matters. Do you really think so? I know so. And I also know that your father and your real mother and Mary Patterson, they all died trying to protect you. That makes you very precious, Mabel. It means your life has meaning that goes beyond just surviving. That evening, Henrik shared something he'd never told another living soul. As they sat by the fire after supper, he spoke about Sarah and Emma, about the guilt he'd carried for failing to save them from the consumption that had claimed their lives. I was a deputy sheriff then, he said, staring into the flames. I knew how to track criminals and investigate crimes, but I didn't know how to fight a disease. I felt helpless watching them fade away, knowing there was nothing I could do to protect them. Is that why you came to the mountains? Mabel asked. To hide from the sadness. Henrik nodded. I thought if I got far enough away from people, I wouldn't have to risk losing anyone else. But you can't really live that way, Mabel. A life without love isn't worth much, even if it's safer. Are you sorry I came here? Sorry you have to worry about protecting me? Henrik looked at this remarkable child, who'd already endured more loss and terror than most adults ever faced, and felt his heart swell with a fierce protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. No, Mabel, I'm not sorry. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. A reason to fight for something good. A family worth protecting. Outside, the wind howled through the peaks with renewed fury, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. The shared burden of loss had become a shared commitment to survival and justice. Henrik began teaching Mabel practical skills. How to read weather signs, how to move quietly through snow, how to hide if danger came. But more importantly, he began planning for spring. When the snow melted and travel became possible, he would need to get Mabel's testimony to federal authorities before her enemies realized their mistake. It would be dangerous, but it was the only way to ensure that her father's sacrifice and Mary Patterson's sacrifice hadn't been in vain. The diary pages lay on the table between them. Silent witnesses to tragedy, but also proof that truth had a way of surviving even the most determined efforts to bury it. Henrik touched the wooden cross on the mantelpiece, no longer seeing it as a monument to his failures, but as a reminder that love endures beyond death. That protection is possible even when loss seems inevitable. Tomorrow he would begin preparing for war. But tonight, he was content to sit with Mabel by the fire, grateful for this second chance at family, this opportunity to fight for justice rather than simply endure solitude. The discovery that changed everything came wrapped in Ruth's burial blanket. Henrik had been preparing to move the child's body to a more secure shelter. The makeshift grave was showing signs of disturbance, from scavenging animals when his fingers encountered something, hard sewn into the quilt's lining, working carefully. To avoid damaging the fabric that had become sacred to Mabel, Henrik found a small metal object wrapped in oiled cloth. When he unwrapped it, his breath caught in his throat. It was a sheriff's badge, tarnished with age, but still bearing clear engravings. Sheriff Edward Whitfield, Laramie County, Wyoming Territory. But this wasn't just any badge. It was the kind of special commission, badge issued to federal investigators working undercover in territorial jurisdictions. Henrik's hands trembled as he turned the badge over, finding additional markings on the reverse. U.S. Marshal Service, Special Investigation Division. Below that, in smaller letters, was a code number that Henrik recognized. From his own law enforcement days, the kind of identifier used for deep cover operations involving federal crimes. Edward Whitfield hadn't just been a county sheriff, investigating local corruption. He'd been a federal marshal working undercover to expose a conspiracy that reached far beyond territorial boundaries. Henrik, Mabel's voice came from behind him, soft but urgent. "What did you find?" He turned to see her standing at the shelter's entrance, her small face pale in the winter light. There was no point in hiding the truth from her. She'd already proven herself capable of handling realities that would break most adults. "Your father's badge," Henrik said, holding it up so she could see. But Mabel, he wasn't just a sheriff. He was working for the federal government, investigating crimes that involved people in Washington. Mabel moved closer, studying the badge with eyes that seemed too old for her face. "I knew Papa was special. He used to get letters with fancy seals, and sometimes men in nice clothes would come to visit him late at night. Mama said he was helping to catch very bad men who stole money from the government." Henrik felt pieces of a much larger puzzle clicking into place. A federal marshal working undercover would have access to evidence that could destroy careers, topple political machines, and send powerful men to prison for decades. If Whitfield had been killed to prevent him from testifying, then the conspiracy he'd been investigating was vast and dangerous, beyond anything Henrik had imagined. "Mabel, do you remember anything specific about what your father was investigating? Any names or places he might have mentioned?" He was careful not to talk about his work around us, but sometimes I would hear him talking to Mama late at night. He said there were men in the territorial government who were stealing land from settlers and selling it to railroad companies, and something about army contracts, food and supplies that were supposed to go to soldiers but were being sold to other people instead. Henrik's blood ran cold. Federal land fraud and military contract corruption were hanging offenses, crimes that carried the death penalty for everyone involved. If Whitfield had gathered evidence of such activities, his murder wouldn't have been the work of local criminals. It would have been ordered by people with connections reaching all the way to Washington. "Did your father ever mention keeping evidence hidden somewhere? Documents or papers that proved what these men were doing?" Mabel nodded slowly. "He had a special place in our house where he kept important papers. But after he died, Mama said the bad men came and searched everything. They took all his papers and burned them in our fireplace. But they didn't get everything, did they?" Henrik asked, remembering the newspaper clipping and diary pages that had been hidden so carefully. Papa was smart. He told Mama that if anything happened to him, she should look for a message he left for her. Something only she would know to find. Mabel's face brightened with sudden realization. The badge. Maybe Papa hid something with the badge. Henrik examined the badge more carefully, looking for any sign of hidden compartments or concealed messages. The metal was solid, showing no evidence of tampering, but something about its weight seemed unusual. It was heavier than a normal badge should be. Working with the tip of his knife, Henrik carefully pried at the badge's backing. After several tense minutes, a thin metal plate separated from the main body, revealing a hollow space containing a tightly rolled piece of paper. With infinite care, Henrik unrolled the paper and spread it on the snow-covered ground. What he found made his pulse race with excitement and terror in equal measure. It was a list of names, dates, and financial amounts, written in a careful hand that must have been Edward Whitfield's. The list detailed fraudulent land sales totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars, with payments traced to specific territorial officials, railroad executives, and even members of Congress. But more damning still were the details about military supply contracts. Whitfield had documented systematic theft of food, medicine, and equipment intended for army posts throughout the territory. Soldiers were going hungry and undersupplied, while contractors and government officials grew rich from selling their provisions to civilian buyers. At the bottom of the list, in letters that seemed to burn with accusation, was a name that made Henrik's blood freeze. Thomas Crane, Territorial Attorney General, $15,000 received for land deed alterations and military contract oversight. Henrik recognized that name. Thomas Crane was the brother of Sheriff William Crane, the man who'd been investigating Mary Patterson's death. If the Territorial Attorney General was involved in the corruption, then local law enforcement couldn't be trusted either. What does it say? Mabel asked, her voice small and frightened. Henrik made a decision that he knew would change both their lives forever. This child deserved to know the truth about her father's sacrifice, about the importance of what she'd helped preserve. Your father was a hero, Mabel. He risked everything to expose men who were stealing from the government and from soldiers who depend on that government to keep them alive. This list proves crimes that could send dozens of powerful men to prison. Does that mean we can get justice for Papa? Henrik folded the paper carefully and tucked it inside his coat. It means we have to try. But it also means we're in more danger than I realized. These aren't just territorial criminals. These are men with connections to the federal government. Men who can order investigations stopped and witnesses silenced. As they walked back to the cabin, Henrik's mind raced with implications. The badge and its hidden evidence were proof of crimes that reached to the highest levels of government. But they were also a death sentence for anyone who possessed them. By spring, when travel became possible again, Henrik would need to find a way to get this evidence to honest federal authorities. But who could be trusted? If the corruption reached into Congress itself, how could they know which officials were honest and which were compromised? That evening, as Mabel slept peacefully in the bed they now shared, Henrik sat by the fire, studying Whitfield's evidence. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a physical burden. This wasn't just about protecting an orphan child anymore. It was about exposing a conspiracy that had cost lives and would cost more if allowed to continue. The wooden cross on the mantelpiece seemed to glow in the firelight. No longer a monument to his failures, but a reminder of the courage required to stand for justice even when the odds were overwhelming. Edward Whitfield had died for this cause. Mary Patterson had died for it. Now it fell to Henrik and Mabel to ensure their sacrifices hadn't been in vain. Outside, snow continued to fall, adding to the walls that protected their small sanctuary. But Henrik knew that when spring came, those walls would melt away, and they would have to face a world where powerful men would stop at nothing to silence the truth. The badge lay on the table beside the lamp, its metal surface reflecting the dancing flames. Tomorrow, Henrik would begin making plans for what might be the most dangerous journey of his life. But tonight, he was content to sit guard over the evidence that could bring justice for the dead and protection for the innocent. Justice, Henrik had learned, was worth any risk. And some fights were too important to avoid, no matter how long the odds or how powerful the enemy. Spring arrived with the subtlety of an avalanche, transforming the mountain landscape from pristine white to muddy brown almost overnight. The snow that had been Henrik's protection for months began its relentless retreat, revealing trails that would soon be passable to determined men with horses and weapons. Henrik had been preparing for this moment since discovering Edward Whitfield's evidence, but the reality of approaching danger still sent ice through his veins. He stood at his cabin window, watching water cascade from the roof in silver streams, knowing that each drop brought his enemies closer to finding them. "How much longer do we have?" Mabel asked from behind him. At 8 years old, she'd developed an unsettling ability to read his moods and anticipate his concerns. "A few weeks, maybe less," Henrik replied, turning from the window. "The main trails will be clear soon, and once they are, men can reach us." Mabel nodded with the calm acceptance that still amazed him. Over the winter months, she'd grown stronger both physically and emotionally, but she'd also gained a mature understanding of their situation that no child should need to possess. Henrik had spent the last month preparing for this inevitability. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the fireplace lay his service revolver, a Colt .45 that had been his companion during his days as a deputy sheriff. He'd cleaned and loaded it weeks ago, along with the rifle he used for hunting and a shotgun he'd acquired from a dead trapper years earlier. But weapons alone wouldn't be enough. Henrik had also been studying the terrain around his cabin, identifying defensive positions and escape routes. The natural bowl that contained his property was both blessing and curse. It provided excellent fields of fire for defending against attackers, But it also limited options for retreat if the defense failed. "Henrik," Mabel said quietly, "I need to tell you something. Something I remembered." He looked down at her serious face, noting the way she worried her lower lip when she was struggling with difficult thoughts. "What is it, child?" "When Papa was alive, he used to take me with him sometimes when he went to meet people. He said I was his good luck charm, and that bad men wouldn't suspect a sheriff who brought his little girl along." Mabel paused, gathering courage for what came next. "I saw some of the men on his list. I know what they look like." Henrik felt his chest tighten. He'd hoped to keep Mabel away from the violence that was coming, to find a way to spirit her to safety before their enemies arrived. But if she could identify the corrupt officials Whitfield had been investigating, her testimony would be invaluable to federal prosecutors. "Can you remember their names? The ones you saw with your father?" "Some of them. There was Mr. Crane, the Attorney General. He came to our house twice, and both times Papa sent me to my room, but I listened from the stairs. Mr. Crane was angry, saying Papa was making trouble that could hurt important people." Henrik nodded grimly. Thomas Crane's involvement had been confirmed by Whitfield's hidden evidence, but Mabel's eyewitness testimony would make the case even stronger. There was also a railroad man named Morrison. He had a fancy watch, and he kept checking it like he had somewhere important to be. And an army man, Colonel something. He wore a uniform with lots of shiny buttons. Each name Mabel provided was another nail in the conspiracy's coffin, but also another reason why powerful men would want her dead. Henrik made mental notes, planning how to document her testimony in a way that would survive, even if they didn't. That afternoon, Henrik began the most difficult preparation of all, creating a record of everything they knew. Working carefully with pen and paper, he documented Whitfield's evidence, copied the names and amounts from the hidden list, and recorded Mabel's testimony about the meetings she'd witnessed. He made 3 copies of everything, sealing each set of documents in oiled cloth and hiding them in separate locations around the property. If their enemies found and destroyed one cache, others would survive to tell the story. "Why are you making so many copies?" Mabel asked, watching him work. Henrik chose his words carefully. "Because sometimes people try to destroy evidence of their crimes. Your father was smart to hide that list, and we need to be just as smart. Are you afraid we're going to die?" The question, asked with such matter-of-fact directness, hit Henrik like a physical blow. He set down his pen and looked into Mabel's eyes, seeing courage there that humbled him. "I'm afraid we might not both survive what's coming," he admitted. "But I'm not afraid of dying, Mabel. I'm afraid of failing to protect you, of letting your father's sacrifice be for nothing. If something happens to you, what should I do?" Henrik had been dreading this conversation, but he knew it was necessary. "There's a cache of supplies hidden in the old mine shaft about 2 miles east of here. Food, water, warm clothes, and copies of all the evidence. If I don't make it, you take what you need and head for Fort Collins. Find the commanding officer and tell him you're Edward Whitfield's daughter. Give him the evidence and tell him everything you remember. Fort Collins is more than 100 miles away. I know. But you're strong, Mabel, and you're smart. If anyone can make that journey, it's you." That evening they had their last normal meal together, though neither acknowledged it as such. Henrik had prepared salt pork and beans, supplemented with the last of his winter vegetables. They ate by lamplight, the familiar routine comforting despite the tension that filled the cabin like smoke. "Henrik," Mabel said as they finished eating, "I want you to know something. These months with you, they've been the happiest time of my life since Papa died. You saved me in more ways than just keeping me alive." Henrik felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You saved me too, child. I was already dead when you arrived. I just hadn't stopped breathing yet. You gave me a reason to live again, a purpose worth fighting for." They spent the evening preparing for what might come. Henrik showed Mabel how to load and fire the revolver, though he prayed she'd never need to use it. He reviewed their emergency plans, making sure she knew where to find everything she might need to survive on her own. As night fell, Henrik took his rifle and walked the perimeter of their property, checking for signs of approaching danger. The melting snow had turned the ground soft and muddy, perfect for tracking, but he found no evidence of human presence. Still, his instincts screamed warnings. The kind of men who'd killed Edward Whitfield and Mary Patterson wouldn't give up easily. They'd spent the winter thinking their problem was solved, believing the evidence had died with the children in that house fire. By now, they would have discovered their mistake. Henrik returned to the cabin to find Mabel sitting by the fire, holding the wooden cross from his mantelpiece. She looked up as he entered, her small face serious in the lamplight. "I've been thinking about Papa and Mama Ruth and Aunt Mary," she said, "about how they all died trying to protect me and Ruth. I don't want anyone else to die because of me, Mabel. But I also know that Papa died for something important. He died trying to stop bad men from hurting other people. If we give up now, if we don't fight to get the truth out, then all those deaths were for nothing." Henrik knelt beside her chair, struck by the wisdom in her words. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm not afraid anymore. I'm sad about Ruth, and I'm sad about all the people who died protecting us. But I'm not afraid of what's coming. We have the truth, Henrik. We have proof of what they did. That makes us stronger than they are, even if they have more guns." Outside, a nightbird called across the darkness, its cry echoing off the surrounding peaks. Spring was bringing more than just melting snow and muddy trails. It was bringing a reckoning that had been building since Edward Whitfield first decided to investigate. Territorial corruption. Henrik looked at the badge and documents spread on their table, physical proof of crimes that reached to the highest levels of government. Tomorrow, he would hide the evidence in its final cache and position his weapons for the fight that was coming. But tonight, he sat with Mabel by the fire, grateful for this moment of peace before the storm. She'd grown so much over the winter, transforming from a traumatized refugee into a young woman of remarkable courage and determination. Whatever came next, he was proud to stand beside her in the fight for justice. The wooden cross seemed to glow in the firelight, no longer a symbol of his failures, but a reminder that some causes were worth any sacrifice. Edward Whitfield had understood that when he chose to investigate corruption, despite the danger, Mary Patterson had understood it when she died creating the illusion of the children's deaths. Now it was Henrik's turn to make that choice, to decide whether justice was worth risking everything he'd learned to love again. As he looked at Mabel's determined face, he knew the answer had never really been in doubt. Some fights chose you, whether you wanted them or not. And this was one fight that had to be won, no matter the cost. They came with the dawn mist, 4 riders moving up the mountain trail with the careful precision of men accustomed to violence. Henrik spotted them from his lookout position behind the cabin, their dark silhouettes emerging from the grey morning like harbingers of death itself. He'd been expecting this moment for weeks, but the reality still sent ice through his veins. These weren't local thugs or opportunistic criminals. They moved with military discipline, their weapons positioned for quick access, their horses chosen for endurance rather than speed. Henrik slipped back to the cabin where Mabel waited, already dressed and ready according to their rehearsed plan. Her small face was pale but determined, showing none of the fear that would have been natural for a child facing such danger. 4 men, Henrik reported quietly. "They'll be here within the hour." Mabel nodded and moved to the table where they'd prepared her testimony letter the night before. The document contained everything she could remember about her father's investigation, the meetings she'd witnessed, and the evidence they'd discovered. It was written in Henrik's careful hand, but signed with her own childish signature, legal proof that would survive even if they didn't. "Are you sure about this?" Henrik asked as she folded the letter and tucked it into the waterproof pouch he'd prepared. "Papa died for the truth," Mabel replied with startling composure. "I won't let his sacrifice be wasted because I was too scared to do what's right." Henrik felt his chest swell with pride and heartbreak in equal measure. This remarkable child had grown into someone who understood courage in ways most adults never would. Whatever happened in the next few hours, Edward Whitfield's daughter would face it with honor. The plan they'd developed was simple, but dangerous. Mabel would hide in the old mine shaft with copies of all the evidence while Henrik attempted to negotiate with their pursuers. If negotiation failed, and Henrik expected it would, he would hold them off long enough for Mabel to escape through the mountain trails they'd scouted during the winter. "Remember," Henrik said as they made final preparations, "if shooting starts, you stay hidden no matter what you hear. Don't come back for me, don't try to help. Your job is to survive and get that evidence to Fort Collins." "I know." Mabel's voice was steady, but Henrik could see tears gathering in her eyes. "Henrik, thank you. For everything. You've been the papa I needed when I didn't have one." The words hit Henrik harder than any bullet could have. He knelt and pulled Mabel into a fierce embrace, memorizing the feeling of her small arms around his neck, the scent of her hair, the trust she'd placed in his weathered hands. "You've been my salvation, little one. Whatever happens, remember that you saved me just as much as I saved you." They separated reluctantly, both knowing this might be their final goodbye. Henrik watched as Mabel slipped out the cabin's back door and disappeared into the pine forest, moving with the quiet confidence he'd taught her during their winter together. Alone now, Henrik checked his weapons one last time. The revolver sat heavy on his hip, familiar and reassuring. The rifle was loaded and positioned near the front window. The shotgun waited by the door, ready for close quarters work if the situation deteriorated that far. Henrik had chosen his position carefully. The cabin's thick log walls would stop most bullets, and the single door forced attackers to approach along a narrow path that offered little cover. More importantly, the defensive position would buy Mabel time to reach safety while keeping the enemy's attention focused on him. The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather. Henrik positioned himself at the window, rifle ready, and waited for his enemies to show themselves. They approached openly, making no attempt at stealth. 4 hard-faced men who moved with the confidence of those accustomed to intimidating their opposition into submission. The leader was a tall, lean man with a distinctive scar running down his left cheek. Henrik recognized him immediately from Mabel's descriptions, the man who'd been hired to transport the children to their deaths. "Henrik Nordahl," the scarred man called out when they were still 50 yards from the cabin. "We know you're in there, and we know you have something that belongs to us." Henrik stepped into the doorway, rifle held ready but not yet aimed. "Name's Henrik, that much is true. But I don't have anything that belongs to you. You have Edward Whitfield's children, or at least one of them. We found the other child's grave behind your cabin." The man's voice carried the flat certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We're here to collect what's ours and settle accounts. The child you're looking for died months ago." Henrik lied smoothly. "Froze to death the same night I found them. I buried her next to her sister. Maybe, or maybe you're lying to protect a witness who could cause powerful men considerable embarrassment." The scarred man dismounted, his companions following suit. "Either way, we're going to search this place thoroughly. You can make this easy or hard. Your choice." Henrik raised his rifle, the barrel pointing directly at the scarred man's chest. "Here's my choice. You gentlemen can turn around and ride back where you came from, or you can find out why smart men don't threaten a father protecting his child." The scarred man's eyes narrowed with interest rather than fear. "Your child, is it? Interesting how quickly a man can form attachments." He signaled to his companions, who began spreading out to flank the cabin. "Last chance, Nordahl. Give us the girl and any evidence you might have found, and we'll make this quick. Keep protecting her, and we'll make sure you both suffer before you die." Henrik's finger found the rifle's trigger as his enemies completed their encirclement. In a few moments, the talking would end and the shooting would begin. But Mabel was safely hidden, and the evidence was secure. Whatever happened to him, the truth would survive. "Come and take her," Henrik said quietly, and waited for the war to begin. The first shot shattered the morning silence like thunder. Henrik's rifle bucked against his shoulder as the scarred man dove behind a fallen log, the bullet splintering bark inches from his head. The other three gunmen immediately opened fire, their weapons barking in rapid succession as bullets thudded into the cabin's log walls. Henrik had chosen his defensive position well. The thick timber absorbed most of the incoming rounds, while the narrow angles of approach limited his enemy's ability to coordinate their attack. But he was still one man against four, and his ammunition was limited. A bullet whistled through the open doorway, embedding itself in the far wall with a sharp crack. Henrik ducked low, working the rifle's lever action to chamber another round, then rolled to the side window for a different angle of fire. One of the gunmen was trying to circle around to the cabin's rear, moving from tree to tree in short rushes. Henrik tracked him carefully, waiting for the right moment, then squeezed the trigger. The man stumbled and fell, clutching his shoulder as his rifle tumbled into the snow. "That's one," Henrik muttered, ejecting the spent cartridge. But his success was short-lived. The remaining three attackers had learned from their companion's mistake, coordinating their movements to keep Henrik pinned down while they advanced. Bullets shattered the window glass above his head, sending razor-sharp fragments cascading to the floor. Henrik grabbed the shotgun and moved to the front door, knowing he needed to break up their advance before they reached the cabin. The scarred man was directing the attack from behind his log, pointing and shouting orders that Henrik couldn't quite make out over the gunfire. Stepping into the doorway, Henrik raised the shotgun and fired both barrels at the nearest attacker. The double load of buckshot caught the man's center mass, lifting him off his feet and sending him sprawling into the muddy snow. The thunderous roar of the shotgun echoed off the surrounding peaks like the voice of an angry god. "Two down," Henrik breathed, breaking open the shotgun to reload, but his exposure had cost him. A bullet from the scarred man's rifle punched through Henrik's left shoulder, spinning him around and sending him stumbling back into the cabin. Pain flared like liquid fire, but Henrik forced himself to keep moving, knowing that stopping meant death. Blood soaked through his shirt as he grabbed fresh shells for the shotgun. His left arm nearly useless now, but his right hand still steady. Through the broken window, he could see the two remaining attackers closing in, their faces grim with professional determination. The scarred man appeared at the side window, his rifle barrel probing through the shattered glass like a steel snake. Henrik spun and fired the shotgun one-handed, the blast taking out the entire window frame in an explosion of wood and lead. The scarred man disappeared with a startled curse, but Henrik heard him moving around toward the back of the cabin. The final gunman kicked in the front door, just as Henrik turned to face him. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the small cabin, weapons raised, death hanging in the balance between them. The gunman fired first, his bullet creasing Henrik's ribs and sending him stumbling sideways. But Henrik's return shot was true, the heavy slug from his revolver catching the man in the chest and dropping him like a felled tree. "Three," Henrik gasped, leaning against the wall as pain and blood loss made his vision swim. The cabin fell silent, except for the ringing in Henrik's ears and the sound of his own labored breathing. But he knew the fight wasn't over. The scarred man was still out there, still dangerous, still determined to complete his mission. Henrik forced himself to move, reloading the revolver with hands that shook from shock and exhaustion. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through his wounded shoulder, but he couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. The attack came from an unexpected direction. Instead of trying to force his way through the doors or windows, the scarred man climbed onto the cabin's roof and began tearing away the wooden shingles. Henrik heard the scraping sounds above his head and realized with growing horror what his enemy intended. "Clever," Henrik admitted grudgingly, then moved to position himself beneath the spot where the sounds were loudest. When the scarred man finally broke through the roof and dropped into the cabin, Henrik was waiting. The two men crashed together in a tangle of arms and weapons, rolling across the floor in desperate hand-to-hand combat. The scarred man was younger and uninjured, but Henrik fought with the fury of a man protecting his child. They struggled for control of the scarred man's knife. the blade gleaming wickedly in the lamplight as it swept back and forth between them. Finally, Henrik managed to slam his enemy's wrist against the stone hearth, sending the knife skittering across the floor. But the scarred man wasn't finished. He wrapped his hands around Henrik's throat, using his weight and position to crush the life from the older man. Henrik's vision began to darken as oxygen fled his lungs. But with his last reserves of strength, he managed to grab a piece of broken glass from the shattered window and drive it deep into the scarred man's neck. The scarred man's eyes widened in shock and pain. He released Henrik's throat and stumbled backward, blood streaming between his fingers as he tried to stanch the wound. "It's over," Henrik rasped, struggling to his feet with the revolver in his hand. The scarred man looked at him with something approaching respect. "Maybe for me, but not for her. There are others who know she's alive now. They'll never stop coming. Then I'll keep stopping them," Henrik replied, and pulled the trigger one final time. Silence settled over the cabin like a shroud, broken only by the sound of snow beginning to fall outside. Henrik sank into his chair, exhausted and bleeding but alive. And somewhere in the mountains, Mabel was safe, carrying with her the evidence that would bring justice for her father and all the others who had died for the truth. The wooden cross lay on the floor where it had fallen during the fight, but Henrik could see it clearly. Some battles were worth any price, and some victories were measured not in survival, but in what you protected while fighting for your life. 6 months later, Henrik stood beside a freshly carved gravestone in the small cemetery behind the rebuilt cabin, his left arm still stiff from the shoulder wound that had nearly cost him his life. The stone was simple but dignified, bearing the inscription he and Mabel had chosen together: "Ruth Whitfield, beloved sister, safe in Angel's arms." The federal investigation that followed their testimony had shaken the territorial government to its foundations. Thomas Crane and 17 other officials now awaited trial in federal prison, their corruption exposed by the evidence Edward Whitfield had died to preserve. The railroad executives who'd profited from stolen land faced similar fates, and military supply contracts were being audited from Denver to Washington. But for Henrik, the real victory stood beside him now, holding a bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked from the mountain meadows. Mabel had grown taller over the summer, her face filling out with the healthy roundness that came from regular meals and peaceful sleep. The haunted look that had shadowed her eyes during those desperate winter months was gone, replaced by the natural brightness of a child who felt safe and loved. "Do you think she would have liked the stone?" Mabel asked, placing the flowers carefully at the grave's base. "I think she would have loved it," Henrik replied, his voice gentle with the warmth that had replaced the bitter isolation of his earlier years. "And I think she'd be proud of her big sister for being so brave." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching clouds drift across the mountain peaks that had witnessed so much tragedy and triumph. The seasons had turned full circle, bringing them back to the kind of peaceful morning that had existed before danger came calling. But everything was different now, Mr. Henrik. Mabel's voice carried the formal tone she used when discussing serious matters. "The judge said I could choose my last name when the adoption papers are finalized. I've been thinking about it." Henrik's chest tightened with emotion he still wasn't entirely comfortable expressing. The federal prosecutor had been amazed by Mabel's courage and clarity during her testimony, calling her the key witness who'd made their case possible. But more importantly to Henrik, she'd proven herself to be exactly the daughter he'd never expected to have again. "What did you decide?" "I want to keep Whitfield as my middle name, so I'll always remember Papa and what he died for. But I want Nordahl to be my last name." She looked up at him with eyes that sparkled with mischief and love. "Mabel Whitfield Nordahl. It has a nice sound, don't you think?" Henrik knelt beside her, no longer caring about the tears that tracked down his weathered cheeks. "I think it's the most beautiful name I've ever heard." The adoption proceedings had been complicated by Mabel's status as a key federal witness. But the territorial judge had fast-tracked the paperwork after Henrik's heroic actions became public knowledge. Newspaper reporters from as far away as Chicago had traveled to their remote cabin, wanting to interview the mountain man who'd single-handedly protected a child witness against professional killers. Henrik had granted exactly one interview to a reporter from the territorial capital who'd promised to focus on Edward Whitfield's heroism rather than sensationalizing the violence. The resulting article had helped ensure that Whitfield received the posthumous recognition he deserved, and that his investigation's findings reached the public despite attempts by corrupt officials to suppress them. But the attention had also brought unexpected visitors. A distinguished gentleman from the U.S. Marshal Service had arrived in late spring, offering Henrik a position as a federal investigator based on his law enforcement background and proven courage. Henrik had politely declined, explaining that his investigating days were behind him. "I have more important work now," he'd told the marshal while Mabel played nearby. "I'm raising a daughter." The cabin itself had been rebuilt and expanded, funded partly by reward money from the federal government and partly by Henrik's own savings. It now included a proper bedroom for Mabel, a larger kitchen where they could cook and eat together comfortably, and even a small room that served as both library and schoolroom. Henrik had hired a teacher from Willow Creek to visit twice a week, ensuring that Mabel received the education her sharp mind deserved. She was already reading at a level far above her age, devouring books about history, science, and literature with an enthusiasm that reminded Henrik painfully of his first daughter, Emma. But Mabel was her own person, strong and resilient in ways Emma had never needed to be. She'd inherited her father's sense of justice and her adoptive father's quiet determination, creating a combination that Henrik suspected would serve her well in whatever future she chose to pursue. "Are you happy here?" Henrik asked as they walked back toward the cabin, the question arising from his occasional worry that a bright child might eventually find mountain life too limiting. "This is home," Mabel replied without hesitation. "You're my family and this is where I belong. Besides," she added with a grin that transformed her serious face, "who else is going to make sure you eat properly and don't spend all your time talking to yourself?" That evening, they sat together on the cabin's new front porch, watching the sun set behind the western peaks in a blaze of orange and gold. Henrik was teaching Mabel to whittle, their conversation punctuated by the gentle sounds of knives shaping wood and the distant call of a hunting owl. On the table between them sat a new drawing Mabel had made, a family portrait showing herself, Henrik, and a small figure with wings that she'd labeled Ruth, watching over us. It wasn't the family any of them had been born into, but it was the family they'd chosen to become through love and sacrifice and the simple decision to care for each other. The wooden cross now hung inside the cabin above the fireplace, no longer a monument to loss, but a reminder that love endures beyond death, that justice is worth fighting for, and that sometimes the most broken people can heal each other if they're brave enough to try. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Henrik felt a peace he'd thought lost forever. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to protect and nurture the remarkable child who'd saved him from his own isolation. But tonight was perfect just as it was, father and daughter together, safe in their mountain home, surrounded by the quiet beauty of a world that had tested them and found them worthy of happiness. Some stories end with dramatic flourishes and grand gestures. Others end with the simple recognition that love, once found, is worth whatever price was paid to preserve it. Henrik Nordahl had learned the truth of that lesson in the hardest way possible. But as he sat beside his adopted daughter under the vast Wyoming sky, he knew with absolute certainty